Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the 37th Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative webinar as part of our Applied Techniques webinar series. Today our presenter is Dr. Janice Gilbert, who will be discussing taking advantage of high water levels to control invasive Phragmites. My name is Samantha Tank, and I'm at the Great Lakes Commission, and I'm hosting the webinar today on behalf of the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. I'm also joined by Elaine Ferrier, Patrick Kenneth, and Erica Jensen. Before we go into our featured presentation, there's just a few housekeeping items that I'm going to review. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative, it's a partnership to link people, information, and action on invasive Phragmites. The collaborative is coordinated jointly by the Great Lakes Commission and the USGS Great Lakes Science Center with funding from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The collaborative facilitates communication among stakeholders across the region, assists in the development of management tools and programs, and serves as a resource center for information on Phragmites biology, management, and research. The collaborative is led by a multi-agency advisory committee and applies principles of collective impact to advance the common agenda for Phragmites management in the Great Lakes region. Another way that the collaborative engages with Phragmites professionals throughout the Great Lakes is through the coordination of the Phragmites Adaptive Management Framework, or PAMF. PAMF is a program that utilizes participatory science to provide data-driven Phragmites management guidance via an adaptive management framework. So what this really means is that we've established a way to learn from what Phragmites managers are doing and turn that data into annual guidance to help those managers make effective and efficient management decisions. We encourage anyone currently managing Phragmites in the Great Lakes Basin to consider joining PAMF. We're planning to host training sessions throughout the Great Lakes Basin, and we'll figure out those locations in the next couple of weeks. And those are going to happen in the spring and early summer to help interested managers get involved. For information on where those training sessions are taking place or more information about the program, you can go ahead and visit the website. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out the resources that we have on the webpage. The address is on the slide right here. And resources include management guidance and recording of past webinar. You can also join our listserv to connect with hundreds of other professionals and sign up for biweekly newsletters, which include a quarterly research roundup of academic papers that have been published in the previous month. And you can find links to join the newsletter and listserv on our front page, and that's www.greatlakesphragmites.net. So today's webinar is being recorded, and all of the past webinars are uploaded onto our YouTube channel and available through our website. You can access an archive of past presentations through their website, and you can view and register for upcoming webinars by the URL that's listed here. So hello to all of you who are watching the recording, and please share this with your colleagues, and don't hesitate to reach out even if it's long past the presentation date. And of course, you can connect with us on social media. Tag us on your Facebook, Twitter post as @GLFrag. So as people come on, we are just going to continue to mute you. You can also do that yourself. We just want to go over a couple more housekeeping things to make sure that the webinar runs smoothly. Audio for this webinar can be streamed through your computer speaker or on a telephone. To use a phone line, select the phone call option from your GoToMeeting dashboard to access the phone number that you can call into, as well as the conference ID and audio pin to connect to the webinar. To use your computer's audio, select that option instead. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, go ahead and send a message to either Patrick Kenneth or Erica or Elaine Ferrier, and you can do that through the chat box on the GoToMeeting dashboard. In order to minimize any potential for interruptions, background noise, like I said, I'm just going to continue to automatically mute all attendees, but you can also mute on your end as well. Questions can be submitted at any time during the webinar, and our speaker is going to take all questions at the end. We're going to do our best to take all questions or comments during the webinar, and we'll note them for after the speaker is finished. And if you need to leave the webinar before we've gotten to your question, go ahead and come back to the recording, and we're going to post the question and answer sessions as well. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our presenter. Dr. Janice Gilbert is the Executive Director at the Invasive Phragmites Control Centre in Ontario. Janice has spent over 20 years researching and assessing wetland ecosystems throughout northern and southern Ontario, Ohio, and Washington state. She is regularly consulted for Phragmites guidance and expertise by municipalities, conservation organizations, and even us here at Janice's experience and expertise has allowed for the successful management of sensitive coastal habitats, invasive Phragmites across the Great Lakes Basin and beyond. So thanks so much for sharing your work with us today. And I'm going to go ahead and transfer ownership of the webinar over to you, Janice, and you can start with your slides. And anyone who hasn't signed on and hasn't muted themselves, go ahead and do that now, please.
Doing the cutting to drown method. I just want to, just for the risk of stating the obvious, my title slide talks about Lake Huron, but the methods I'm going to be talking about are obviously they can be used in any water body.
And Janice, did you go ahead and select the accept presenter?
Okay, how's that?
Perfect. We can see you. You're good to go. Take it away.
Wonderful. Did you hear my introduction at all, Sam?
Yes.
Good. Okay, thank you. So when you first asked me to present, I thought, okay, what am I going to talk about for an hour? And then when I finished putting my talk together, how am I going to get through this in an hour? But anyway, here we go. So I thought I would start off just with some background information and then focus specifically on how cutting to drown works, and then get into the specific tools that we use to drown frag, and then give some project highlights, because within those projects are some what I call little big things making a project successful. And where I wanted to start with was the water levels on Lake Huron. And most of us know that there's a long-term data set on the Great Lakes water levels, and they naturally go up and they naturally go down. And the last low water period started at the end of 1990s and continued through into 2000s. And at about 2014, the lake started to rise and rise and rise. And I put my little red dot up here. Can you see my cursor by chance?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So you see that dot way up there for 2019, and for those of folks that live on the Great Lakes, they know this already. Just record high levels all across the Great Lakes last year, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers predict another high lake level year. This gray on this chart here. So we're in for some more high lake levels, and the impacts on humans, of course, have been pretty catastrophic. We like to live by the water, and when the lakes are down, we build pretty close, and then up pops the lake, and there's all kinds of damage to infrastructure, homes, cottages. And then the impacts on recreation, of course, have been felt for a couple of years now. Our lake shrunk, or beaches shrunk, I should say. So we used to be able to have sand way out into the lake, and now we have these little narrow strips for people to sit on the shoreline. But when you add high lake levels and high winds, you can get quite some energetic activities going on along the shoreline, lots of erosion and storm events, and it's quite spectacular actually, but also a lot of damage occurring. And when you go back to your shore after a big storm, it just doesn't look the same at all. It's just totally altered. Large trees have been taken away and all kinds of debris and destruction. But one of my early mentors said to me, you know, it's an ill wind. It doesn't blow somebody some good. And with high lake levels, it's provided us another opportunity to deal with Phragmites in a different way, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Back in 2005, I was assessing wetlands in Rondeau Bay on Lake Erie, and that's when I became aware of invasive Phragmites in our coastal wetlands in the Great Lakes. I had no clue it was a problem on the Great Lakes. I knew it was a problem on the Atlantic seaboard and the wetlands along that coastline there, but I did not understand how big of an impact it was having on our coastal wetlands. And it was at that time I really dove into the top of, what are the impacts and how can we deal with this plant appropriately in these sensitive habitats. And one of the papers I came across was in the United States in impounded wetlands where they could draw down the water, they cut the frag, and they would flood back up. And the systems I was working were natural wetlands. They didn't have the ability to alter the water levels. They were directly connected to the lake and had that natural flux. But I thought if we go into an area I knew would flood up in the spring, we cut out those straws, as I call them, and just see what happened. And you see the photo on the right. Well, it actually did kind of knock Phragmites back a bit. The water depths were about 30 centimeters maximum. And at that point in time, the water, that was as high as the water was going to get. Because that was the local lake level period. And I looked around and saw all that sea of frag. I thought, well, at this point, I'm parking that method because it's just not going to work in these systems. And swung over to, investigating the herbicide aspect of it. And in Ontario and Canada, we don't have currently a water-safe herbicide for dealing with Phragmites. All that we had available to us were herbicides that we could use where it was dry. And so that's what we were doing in these areas, taking advantage of the lower lake levels, going in where we could and spraying the herbicides and getting rid of the Phragmites that way. So just an example here, my buddy Darren standing. This is a coastal wetland. Lake Huron was, the Phragmites was sprayed and rolled and burned, and the native plants popped up. But there was remnant Phragmites, and we know, using chemicals, it's really hard to get 100% kill after your first spray, particularly where it's just so thick. And then the lake popped up, and we couldn't go back in and finish the work we had started. So a large section of that shoreline was almost restored, and we didn't have the proper herbicide to deal with it, and we had to leave it. And much to my chagrin, a lot of that area has just grown back in about 70% frag, so lots of frustration there. And the water was kind of shallow in those areas, so we couldn't spray and we couldn't do much about frag there. But what about where the Phragmites was growing in the deeper water? And so started reinvestigating that cutting to drown method. And my mentor always told me, know thine enemies, so you can kind of understand what you're up against and how to really effectively deal with what you're dealing with. And so you look at the plant, Phragmites is like other wetland plants. It has the ability to deal with flooded conditions because of these parenchyma, these tissues that allow for gas exchange between the parts that are above the water column down to the below ground structures. And we know from research that even those standing dead Phragmites stems from previous years' growth also provide important conduit for the oxygen flow to get from above the water down into the below ground structures. Phragmites also can develop these adventitious roots along the stalk to help bring in the oxygen through the water column. And because they're colonal, they're connected underground by tissues to help facilitate oxygen flow. So if we look at this really simple schematic of Phragmites, we've got, so the gray is the sediment level. There's no water here. And we've got the parts above the sediment, the stolon that runs along the top of the sediment, and the rhizomes, which we don't tend to see, where the stalks pop up every once in a while, and then our roots that are collecting the oxygen through the soil pores. And there's a lot of below ground biomass, and we know this from numerous studies, almost 2-3 times what you see above ground is below ground. So lots of roots and lots of rhizome material. And there's a lot of chambers for holding the oxygen and the gas, and they're all connected. So this is what you normally don't see, but along the shoreline during after heavy storm events, you see the the below ground structures exposed, and you get an idea of how much gas chambers there are down there and how they're all connected. When you add water, the plants themselves start to develop these feathery roots and up the stalk here. And so in this photo, the water is well over 1 meter deep, and at every node, there's these adventitious roots that are coming out to capture the water through the water column to help get more oxygen down to the below ground structures. There is a limit, though, to how deep the Phragmites can grow in water, even with all these adaptations. And it's about 1.5 meters. This is from studies over in Europe where the plant's native plant over there, and certainly we see that as well over on this side of the pond along the lake shore. Also noticing with those high lake levels and those high energy events, those big storm events, where the lakeside edge of even the high density Phragmites is getting beat up and ripped out and kind of held at bay on the lakeside edge. And something else I noticed just this past year, I went into an area where we were going to cut out the Phragmites, and well, where did the frag go? There used to be a huge patch. And the water was calm enough that day. I could see down through the water column. It was about 1.5 meters deep water. And there all the frag stalks were thick laying on the bottom. And I think what happened was the ice froze around the stalks. And then with the wave action, it kind of sheared the stalks off. And then they all laid down. And the water was too deep for new shoots to come up. So Mother Nature is helping us in some of these areas, which is absolutely fantastic. But in a lot of the areas, we need to actually go in and do work as well. So when the lake levels popped up in 2015, started manually cutting Phragmites, and I had set plots up in some of these systems we were working in just to try and track how well that method would work. And so I had plots across the water depth gradient and in high density Phragmites. So in this graph here, you see where the Phragmites was around about 138 stalk stems at the highest count in the plots, and on average about 80. And we went in and cut in that area, and we were able to reduce the stalks down to about 90%. And the water depths in this system were ranged from about ankle deep up to about 0.5 meter. And so in my plots where there was 0.5 meter deep water, we could get 90% mortality. And in water depths, in subsequent years doing this work, lots of plots out there, and when we get to water depths at about 70 centimeters or deeper, after one cut, we can achieve 100% mortality. So we cut the frag and we reduced it 90% and went in and cut again, and there was still some frag remaining that could grow. And the reason for that is just the shallow water depths in those areas. And so here's just a photo of one of those cut stalks, and there's those adventitious roots there. And where the water was not deep enough, what happens is there's enough oxygen in all those below ground gas chambers to supply enough to get another shoot up through the water column. And then once the plant breaks that water surface and gets exposed to the atmosphere, then it can start pumping the oxygen back down. So where the water depths are around less than your kneecap, for instance, you will get regrowth just for that reason. And the other thing is that the plants are connected underground. So if you've got some plants in the water you're cutting, but they're connected to plants that are out of the water, you're going to still get that oxygen exchange below ground. So here's just an example of how that would work. If you're cutting the frag out of here, and these plants are still going to be supplying the oxygen below the ground there. So what I wanted to first start off with, these three methods, tools that we use, and anybody can actually use these methods. If you like to be outside and you're physically active, these methods are available to anyone. But what I want to mention first was cutting is only a part of it. The other piece is actually getting the cut frag out of the water. And it's really important that we make sure that we do that for a number of reasons. This is just a stalk that's fallen in the water, and all along the stalk at these nodes, you get roots forming and another shoot forming. Or even if the stalk has broken and you've had just a little bit of viable material left on that shoot, it can start a new shoot and roots. And here's one of those rhizomes that's been exposed, and there again it's going to start a new plant on its own. And if you're cutting later in the season when the seeds have matured, and if you leave those seed heads on the ground in the spring, if they're in moist conditions, they can start to germinate as well. So the first method I wanted to talk about was the spading method, and this was a method that was developed by Lynn Short, who teaches horticulture at Humber College in Toronto. And on Lynn's family cottage at the south end of Georgian Bay, sandy shoreline was all socked in with Phragmites, and she started spading, and it took her 7 years, and she cleared off her shoreline using that method. And it can be used on dry land or in water. And there are postcards that have been developed illustrating this method. They're available on the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative website and a couple of other websites as well if you're interested. But basically, you take this spade and sharpen the edge, and you use your leg muscles, and you slice the plant below the ground. And the key is you slice on the angle, and you don't disturb the sediment, and you pop the stalk. And I absolutely love this program. So Lynn cleared her shoreline, and her neighbors who weren't as physically able to take care of their shoreline asked if she could help. So she rounded up some local kids, had the summer off. The landowners would pay the kids cash, and they work with Lynn from 8 till noon in the day. They have the afternoon off, and she teaches them about beach ecology. She's out there volunteering, and she teaches them all about the native plants and the insects and the birds and the connection between having healthy shoreline, leaving the native vegetation on the shoreline, and water quality and the quality improvement for the whole lake, for the whole ecosystem. So the kids take that message back to their parents and other grown-ups that have what I call the Bahama Beach syndrome, that just want all sand and no vegetation whatsoever. And in that respect, just shares information with the kids who share it to the adults, and helping to improve the health along the shoreline there. And they are so efficient. She's got them in cutting out the frag, and they lay it down, and they fold it up and put it in these paper yard waste bags. And then they either leave the bags with the landowners, and when it dries, they can just burn it, or they take them to the landfill site. The other method that's really popular is this cutting to drown method using the cane cutters. These are raspberry cane cutters. They're available from a company called Lee Valley. They're aluminum handles. They're telescopic, so you can extend them out. They have a really sharp blade, and you just run the blade down the stalk of the Phragmites and just pull, and it slices it off. And so it allows you to selectively harvest and leave the native plants all around it. And you can use an ice fishing sled or your kayak or canoe or whatever just to gather the cut material. And it's a great community building exercise. You can get your neighbors out. It's not noisy, so you can talk to each other, and you can clear a large area with a number of people out there enjoying the warm summer day for a few hours of work. The other method we use is still brush cutters, and these are really handy where the Phragmites is higher density, too much for spading and too much for those cane cutters. And it's really effective. The thing is, these machines were not designed to work in water, but I have units that I've been using in water since 2015. And basically the trick is, when you're finished, just make sure you grease these areas down here really well, pushes the water out of the unit. My mechanic has actually put grease nipples on the units for me to make that easier. And then we just spray the blades so that they don't rust up. And they've funked in the water a few times, but they're still running, and they're really handy tools for, as I said, doing larger areas. And so this is one of the projects, the very first cutting project we started in 2015 in Wood Drive. And the guys were able to clear a substantial area using that equipment, but there's limitations even for these still cutters. And there you see this wall of frag behind Josh. It's too hard to cut for the machines and certainly for the guys. And the other piece to that is all that cut material has to come out of the system. And back when we first started, it was all manually undertaken. But I knew about these machines in Sweden, these truck saws, and these units are specifically designed to go into the water. They're amphibious units. They have these heavy-duty cutting heads on them in these rakes, and they were quite expensive. So, but I knew that was the answer to helping these groups deal with these large, massive stands of Phragmites. And in 2017, I formed the Invasive Phragmites Control Centre. I was set up as a not-for-profit, and what that allowed me to do was to have 3 amazing partners join me: Bruce Power, Greenstream, and Lambton Shores Phragmites Community Group. And with these partners, I was able to get the funding in place to get a truck saw, get the infrastructure in place to have the trucks and the trailers and the crew to go do the work, and then have a group that I could work with to test out some of these methods and fine-tune them before rolling them out to other areas. The other reason I wanted to set up this control center was I saw there's a real gap out there and for helping people deal with Phragmites appropriately, particularly in these sensitive areas. And so with the control center now, I'm able to help fulfill a role and fill in some of these gaps. And we have currently now 5 programs underway. The trucks are cutting program, a manual control program where I have a crew that will go do the manual cutting and also a backpack herbicide where necessary. We do monitoring to assess how our methods are doing and the impacts on the ecosystem. Outreach is a really big, important deal for me to educate people about Phragmites and how to deal with it appropriately, and also the training as well to show folks how to deal with Phragmites, and research and development, always looking for improving how we're doing these control actions. And part of the outreach, I've undertaken workshops where I train folks how to do the spading and the cutting and all those little big details, I call them, and how to successfully deal with Phragmites in the water. And the other thing I did was I went to Lee Valley and I said, I'm going to be buying bulk of these cutters. Will you give me a discount? And they did. And then through Bruce Powers helped me offset the costs. I'm able to supply them to groups at a substantially reduced cost as well. And there's postcards that go along with that showing how that method works. And they're also available on the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative website. But I want to take a little bit of time just to talk about the trucksaw cutting program, because this was a game changer to be able to bring into these machines. In 2017, I had one, and then since 2018, I was able to get a second one. And so we can go in and now deal with the really high density Phragmites that local groups can't deal with. We can cut it and we can haul it out of the water. But there's a lot more to this than just taking machines in to cut Phragmites. And I just wanted to spend a little bit of time sharing this because it's so important to me that this work is done appropriately. We actually don't start that work until July 18th, and it's for fish spawning regulations, but it also gives the birds time to nest and bring up their young, because they will use the edge of Phragmites, even the high density Phragmites. We do not do any work in our wetland areas in the spring at all. There's just too much wildlife activity going on to be in there mucking around. I also have a really experienced crew. I'm very fortunate that I have a crew that not only have the skill set for the maintenance piece and operating the equipment and looking after them, but also have that mindset of working in sensitive habitats and how to do that appropriately. And I don't send the crew anywhere until I've gone and assessed the site, because there's so many logistics with doing this work, how to access it, what do you do with the biomass, how much of my crew is required there, and are there going to be volunteers there, and what are their role and how to keep them safe? Do we need boats and barges and backhoes and all that? So there's a lot more to it. But as I mentioned, the wildlife do utilize the edges of Phragmites, and along our coastal areas, even where there's really high density frag, they use that structure to nest in. There's a lot of edges for the wildlife. And here's my little Where's Waldo slide. In a couple of sites, we've actually stopped cutting in an area where we noticed some bird activity, and we've just left it because the birds haven't finished nesting. And we've either gone back later in the season or the following year. And I tell folks, I ask why. I say, well, Phragmites, didn't arrive overnight, and it's not going to go away overnight. And 1 year's not going to matter, or a few months difference, and just let the wildlife do what they need to do before we get mucking around back in there. And with higher lake levels, we're certainly seeing more activity by amphibians and fish and whatnot, and turtles as well. One turtle researcher at one of our sites, she had tracking devices on the turtles, and she was telling me they were actually out at the edge of the lake in the thick Phragmites. And I said, what are they doing in there? And she said they're eating on the snails. So with the high lake levels, and the lake was really high out that end, about 1.5 meters deep, they could get up along where the leaves are and graze on the snails out there. So at that particular site where we're going to cut, we waited until the turtles had moved back in interior of the wetland well into September, and they were moving back in where they overwinter before we even started cutting in that area. And of course, where we're working at a lot of these sites, there's it's not just high density frag, so there's a lot of wildlife around these areas, so we have to be cognizant of that. And here's one of my crew chief, Chad McCune. He's been with me since this would be his 6th year, and really experienced on these machines. And they go slow, or for a number of reasons. There's a lot of obstructions, boulders and whatnot in some of these sites, but also the wild. I have not seen as much while I've been working on a truck saw. Like the muskrats are just sit and look at you and munch, and it's actually pretty cool. They aren't disturbed by the machines at all, but we have to be, as I mentioned, cognizant where the nests are and just watch where we're going. The other consideration is where we're working, where there's open water, to try and contain the cut material. So we'll put up these booms in areas, or we'll leave a barrier along the outer edge to contain the cut material, so it doesn't all float away on us. And then what do you do with that biomass? That's a huge consideration. So in some sites, we can actually bring it right on the shore with the truck saws and pile it. And then the partners that we're working with, if they're able to, they can spread it out, and when it's dry, it gets burned. In other areas, we can actually find sites really close by where we can make what I call these giant muskrat dens. So we actually leave the Phragmites on site. So yeah, it has to be well away from any wave action or whatnot, in areas where we're not putting on top of sensitive plants or whatnot. But what I found is that the turtles actually bask on it, and the wildlife, the birds will nest on top of these structures. And if it's high and dry, the Phragmites will not resprout. Where they have resprouted, you can actually just go and pull the new shoots out of the piles and just lay them on top to dry. So it seems to be working really well in some sites. But a lot of these sites that we're working, that's not appropriate either. There is no place to really put the Phragmites. So we have these collection barges, and these were designed by the Lambton Shores Phragmites Community Group. So they're basically docking material from jet float, and they worked with the owner of the jet float company and designed these barges, and then they got these kelp nets to put on top. So basically, they're at a height which is really nice for the truck saws to pile the cut material on top of them. They've got a motor mount, and we can transport the cut material to shore where the frag is unloaded. And then it is either transported to local landfill or other area for disposal. There are quite a few groups working on cutting to drown method in the province. These are just the ones that I'm aware of. So you see that asterisk. I'm sure there are many, many more. But these are just the ones that I know of. And with our truck saw cutting program, we've been to 19 sites now, helping various groups out. with the high density Phragmites. So really successful program. And I just wanted to highlight just a few of these, and I'm going to start up in Manitoulin Island. Judith Jones is a species at risk plant ecologist, and she lives on the island, and she started noticing Phragmites impacting the plants and some of those rare habitats up there. And she set about to educate herself about Phragmites, and she formed a group and joined forces with Manitoulin Stream, which is another not-for-profit on the island, and so was able to secure some funds, and I got a crew together and started mapping Phragmites on the island, educating all of the townships, municipalities about Phrag and First Nations communities, and working to get it off the roads and storm water management ponds and all those infrastructures. But our focus has been along the shoreline, and we went in 2017 into this one area, Blue Jay Creek, and the whole shoreline is over a 2 kilometer stretch was had Phragmites along it. And so I've been taking the trucks that was there 2017, 2018, and again last year. And we work with Judith. This is her right here, cutting with her crew, and our crews work together. We focus on the fine tuning and picking up the frag, while the truckers are picking up the cutting and picking up the big stuff. And because we're working at least a kilometer from shore, our little collection barges can only take so much. So she hired this big barge to take a lot of the cut material as well. And then she was also able to get, as in-kind support from the township of Tekema, their crews to come with their equipment to unload our barges for us and take the material away to the local landfill, which was a huge in-kind support. So here's Judith sitting on the last pile of frag we pulled out this year, and this is the shoreline way over here that we've been clearing off of Phragmites. This was the last big section that we had to deal with last year, and I don't believe we're going to have to go back with the truck oars next year in this particular embayment at all, which is really wonderful. The next area I wanted to take you to is Oliphant. There are a number of groups working in this area to deal with Phragmites. Oliphant is a big cottage community, lots of islands out there, lots of cottages, but it's also really important fish spawning habitat, really important wetlands there, and Phragmites had just taken over. And so a number of groups very concerned about the Phragmites and are working together to deal with it. One of the amazing frag busters there, Leslie Woods, who's spent many hours out knocking on doors, going around various islands, educating the cottagers about Phragmites, talking to council members about Phragmites, out actually harvesting Phragmites with her family and friends. Just a real go-getter up there. She was able to get the South Bruce Peninsula Township to provide this bin so that they could bring all their cut frag to this bin, and then they would haul it away free of charge for them, as in kind. And when we started coming up there in 2017, I was just amazed at the number of people that came out to help work with our crews, picking up the cut Phragmites, bringing their own boats and their own equipment to help us deal with the Phragmites, and it was just really neat. And we started in 2017. This photo was really thick frag. The trucks cleared it out in 2017, and in 2018, that's what's left of it. So the local volunteer cottagers came out and just dealing with these thinner patches. And what happened last year was one of the council members, Paul McKenzie, owns his barge. He saw us hauling the Phragmites back on our collection barges and brought his big barge out to help as well. Just in kind, he rented this little bobcat, and it was a huge force to be able to bring in all that biomass into shore. And with the manager of operations, Chris Cornfield, and his crew with the town of South Bruce, they supplied in kind their equipment to haul away the Phragmites and are taking it to an area where they actually stored snow, a big works depot. They were going to take it to a quarry, and it was too wet. And Chris was just trying all kinds of things, getting the local volunteer fire department involved to try and burn the frag when it was dried out. But then it was rainy and wet in the fall, and they couldn't do that. And he looked into a firebox air burner. This was used down when Hurricane Katrina, to try and clean up all the debris. It doesn't allow any smoke or soot to escape, but it was just too expensive to bring that in. So basically he told me what he's going to plan to do this spring is just take all these frag that's been piled on site and bury it. So I mentioned we started first working in Oliphant in 2017, and when you came to the main dock there and looked out into the big bay, just like a sea of Phragmites, and it's like, oh my goodness, it's quite a disaster there. And I recall hearing some people saying, like, why are you even bothering? Like, it's too far gone. You're just wasting your time and effort. And this is why I'm just so excited. There are so many people up there that are really passionate about getting rid of Phragmites because it's working. And every year, more and more people get involved because they see the positive results up there. And there's a great community building spirit that's going on up in Oliphant. The next place I'm taking you down to is a municipality of Lambton Shores, and this is home of the Lambton Shores Phragmites Community Group. Nancy Vidler here is the executive director. These folks are all volunteers. All but one is retired, and they were the first group to actually undertake a watershed approach. They started on their own beach and got rid of frag there, and they looked around and said, well, that's not going to do any good if we don't deal with it in other areas. Had a management plan developed, educated their municipality, the conservation authorities, agricultural community, working to get it off the roads. And it's just an amazing group of very dedicated fraggers. What they also did was undertook to help restore this large coastal wetland system known as Wood Drive. It was basically orphaned, all socked in with Phragmites. The only wetland on Lake Huron that's in the Carolinian zone, species at risk habitat, provincially significant, globally rare designations, and all that. So since 2012, they've been working on securing funds and helping to get this wetland restored. I'm just going to focus on this area up here known as Block 1 up in the north end, and then down in this area here. And it was up in Block 1 where we first started the manual cutting of the Phragmites. And when we brought in the truck source again in 2017, 2018, a big game changer in how much we could actually clear out of that wetland system. And so in areas where the truck sources have been, now it's just all manual control. And so here's Nancy and her group members with the stewardship rangers from the St. Clair Region Conservation Authority. So they can just basically go in and do the fine tuning around the boulders and other obstructions in areas where that had previously been really high density Phragmites. Because this is a coastal wetland, we left this large fringe of Phragmites out at the lake to intercept that wave energy, and that's given the native plants an opportunity to grow. So this is just one shot, but there's the cattail. All the plants have grown back in now behind that thick wall of Phragmites. So that was taken out last year. So that whole block has been dealt with the Phragmites. Down at the far end of that system is Lambton Centre, a Shoreline property, and this is a church camp and a family campground, and they hadn't used the lake for well over a decade. They actually put in a pool because they couldn't access the lake to swim, and the property manager way back when the lake levels were low had tried everything, tarping and herbicide application and whatnot, and managed to kind of keep the frag at bay along the shore. So here some of the campers are using the spading method to deal with the little bit of frag that's come back in after treating. But it was this frag that's out in the lake that they couldn't deal with. And so we were able to take the truckers in 2017 and clear out a large section. And in 2018, for the first time in years, the campers were able to access the lake and use the lake, which was pretty exciting. At the north end of Lambton Centre is the south end of that Wood Drive coastal wetland. So really nice partnership where the crews can access that wetland from the church campground property and work up that shoreline. And as part of that partnership, they had in 2018 a volunteer day where they invited folks in to help deal with the remnant frag on the shoreline. They brought in the local council members, the mayor came and asked the local MPP to come. His representative came, brought in the local newspaper just to educate people about the issue. And so we even had folks from Long Point, Lake Erie come to help out. And as I mentioned, they're just doing the fine tuning. And so basically that shoreline has now been all cleared out of Phragmites, and we're still working in the central area of that wetland, but a great success story again to share with you. It's going to pop up to a municipality of Kincardine shoreline here, and this is I call this a doppelganger of Lambton Centre. This is Brucedale Conservation Area. It's a campground. Again, same thing. The campers hadn't seen the lake. It's way out here in years. The whole shoreline was socked in with Phragmites. So we started working there. I should mention with this particular project here, it's a partnership with the Saugeen Valley Conservation Authority, Lake Huron Centre for Coastal Conservation, Enbridge, and the municipality of Kincardine, and just a great partnership on this project. And basically, I started there helping that group out when the lake levels were low. We would manually cut and sprayed what we could in the dry areas. And again, we were able to clear out this little swaths of the lake with the crew just manually cutting. And I can remember some of the campers just cheering. They hadn't seen the lake in so long. They were so excited. But when we were able to bring in the truck source, again, that was just a game changer for us. Able to open up a large section of that embayment that was just socked in with Phragmites. And at the lakeside edge, looking back in towards shore, this is what it looked like. That's Karen Alexander for the folks that know her. And from that exact same vantage point, after the truck source cleared that out, that's what Phragmites was left. And so that can now be managed, as you can see from this crew from the Saugeen Valley Conservation Authority and Lake Huron Centre for Coastal Conservation. They're just in there manually cleaning up what's there. We did not have to go back last year. They had a couple of work parties hosted just to manually clear out the small amount that had come back in. But that's their embayment now. Another great success story. And that is along the shoreline of municipality Kincardine. It's about a 19-kilometer stretch that was just socked in with Phragmites, and we're using the truck source again to clear out those large embayments now and systematically cleaning up that shoreline using that method. And I can't leave the Kincardine shoreline without mentioning this amazing group, Kincardine Residents Against Phragmites. And I always laugh because they didn't realize their acronym was CRAP. But anyway, these three ladies on the left here, in the area around Kincardine where they live, they got this coalition together and have cleaned up the Phragmites along that whole shoreline. The dry areas they brought in, we dealt with the dry areas with the herbicide, but all the wet areas are out showing the cottagers how to deal with it using those methods that I mentioned, the spading and the cane cutting and the steel cutters. Just a wonderful project there. And the last one I want to highlight is up in Georgian Bay. And this is being undertaken by Georgian Bay Forever, headed up by David Sweetnam and Heather Sargent. And I'm so grateful that they are taking this on, because without their work up there, that whole area would be an absolute disaster. So they started going out and educating the cottage community about Phragmites, giving them the tools to deal with it, would go and help them. They have crews that go and assist and have these work parties planned along the shoreline. And just as I said, a great success story up there as well. They're working to get it with the municipalities and Ministry of Transportation off of the roads to reduce the spread vector, and just trying to build capacity in that area to deal with the Phragmites. And we were asked to come up to help in a couple of sites. This one here, Lily Pond, was just too much for manual control, so the trucksters went in 2018 and again in 2019 and have cleared that area out. And we plan to go up this year to help out in a couple of embayments as well, where there's too much Phragmites for manual control. So I've been at this a long time, and I do have some thoughts on how to approach this this very difficult task. And the one thing is locally driven. When you have those local advocates, when you have those people that are passionate and care, that is key. And when they have volunteer groups formed and they're out there working endless hours, trying to deal with Phragmites in their communities, they need support, and because there is a risk of them burning out. And I'm really, really happy that I can bring the trucksters crew in and we can help them in those areas where it's just too much for them. That gives me a lot of satisfaction that able to do that. But there's a lot more support that they need, and on all levels of government, local, provincial, state, federal, funding support and in kind as well. And I just want to say that because, you know, these are amazing people that they really care about their communities, and they're there for the long haul. And it's really important to keep supporting them. The other key piece is just having that plan. So making sure that you're not just focused on one small area, but the bigger picture of where you're dealing with, and bringing in those partnerships, those different landowners, and working together collaboratively, and dealing at the problem with all different options as best you can. Prioritizing where you're working, of course, and sharing the cost burden, but building into that short-term capacity and the long-term capacity, because Phragmites control, successful Phragmites control is not short-term by any stretch. We're looking at many years to really deal with this plant. And as mentioned earlier, like when you're first starting, it just seems like such a daunting task. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. There are many success stories out there, and we are winning this battle. So I just wanted to share that positive message to folks out there that are struggling with this problem. And I do try to tell people where it's just starting to pay attention to it, because eventually you're going to have to deal with it. So it's much easier, as many of you know, to deal with it when it's just getting started. So I've thrown a lot of information out. And before I go back to the questions, I just want to point out this plant here. It's silvergrass. It's sold by the nurseries. I am starting to see this plant spreading along our roads, and it's actually out-competing Phragmites. So I just put that out there, that I think that this is one that we need to be paying attention to. It's a really pretty grass as well. And let's not let it get to the point that Phragmites is currently. Anyway, that's my talk, and I welcome any questions.
Thanks, Janice. That was great. That was a lot of information and a lot of really great pictures and a really inspirational story. So we're going to move on to questions now. We are about 5 minutes out from the end of our webinar time, but if you want to type in your questions in the chat box, Janice has agreed to stick around for a little bit longer. Even if you need to sign off, you can always see your questions answered later on the recording. So I'm just going to take control real quick, Janice, and we'll move to questions. Okay, so our first question is coming from Drew. You answered most of his question already, Janice, but in terms of when you're removing a lot of the biomass from those aquatic areas and you have concerns about it flowing away and establishing new stands, is there anything that you can do besides burning it? Then maybe some local landowners aren't going to be able to do that, or stacking it up and creating these large piles. Are there other options for disposing that you know of?
So, well, when you're dealing with the amount of biomass that I was showing you with the truck source, that's a lot to deal with, and so that's where those partnerships really are important. And I mentioned, the town of South Bruce have been helping get rid of it up in Olifant, but so has the municipality of Kincardine. I was really remiss in not mentioning that, where they have, as in-kind support as well, been trucking away the pile of forest and taking it to their municipal landfill. So if you can tap into the Public Works Department or your local government to help facilitate the removal of the Phragmites, that is really huge piece of it. And I showed the pile where we leave I call them the muskrat dens, and we leave it. If you can get Phragmites to an area where it's dry, it just dries out, it's not going to spread. It's not going to resprout. And so the only caveat to that is if you're cutting later in the season where you have the seed heads. So if you're transporting, then you have to contain the seed heads so they're not blowing out the back of the truck. But other than that, you don't have to really worry about Phragmites spreading, because it's not going anywhere once you've just piled it. So if you do have the seed heads, you can cover the piles with tarps. And then once you're well into the next summer, the seeds won't be viable anymore, and you can pull the tarps off if you want. And eventually the piles will shrink down. You can mulch too, like you can pulverize if you have some kind of equipment to cut the frag up. And I do know down at Long Point here, where they have those marsh masters and the big brush hog kind of attachments, they can kind of cut up the stalks and kind of disperse it throughout the system, so they're not actually hauling it away. But that doesn't work in water, of course. That's just in areas where the machines can work high and dry. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that was comprehensive. Thanks, Janice. We have another question from Kirsten, and Kirsten wants to know what's the minimum acreage that you would recommend before you get a truck soar out there?
It depends how many volunteers you have. I mean, if you've got a crew of 3 on those steel cutters, you can get a lot of Phragmites cut in a day. The other piece of that is the picking up, right? So it depends on how many people you have that are available to do the manual cutting and the picking up. But I think once you get past about an acre, you're probably wanting some mechanical support there. And also too, if you have a number of different areas, even if they're smaller patches within where you bring the truck soars in and they can go to a number of different areas in a day or while they're in that site, just to be more efficient, that's another option as well. But I'm sorry, it's not a black and white answer for you, but it just depends on how many people you have to run those still saws and then pick up the material. But yeah, I'd say cut off around an acre. Maybe.
Great. Amy asks if there's an ideal time during the growing season to implement the manual cutting efforts.
Well, for the spading, I mean, Leslie Wood's done a lot of work on this, and she's there's actually her research papers available as well for folks to read. But what Lynn suggests, like, if you can only do this once, why don't you wait till the plant is used all the energy from the below ground structures to build that stalk, and then before the seeds start to develop, then just snip it off. And so what that does, it stops the plants from translocating the nutrients back down, building up storage in the below ground structures again. So that's one point for that method. For the cutting to drown all that, as you see, there's really, I mean, if you can get out in the spring and cut them, that's great. And the only caveat again is, you don't want to go into areas where you're disturbing the wildlife. But if you can do that without disturbing them and cut the frag as it's just starting to grow up, I'd say the more you can do that, the better chance you're going to have of drowning the plants, particularly if it's shallower water. And then obviously too, if you can get the plants before those seeds mature, that's ideal, just because then you're not having to deal with them.
Thanks. Jennifer wants to know if you could clarify the regulations that are limiting the movements of invasive plants off-site. And this one is going to be specific to Ontario. I will just preface your response saying that different countries and different states all have different regulations for this. But if you could speak to the regulations about moving the material in Ontario, that'd be great, Janice.
Yeah, so I think this is like a municipality by municipality, because I've heard that some municipalities are treating Phragmites as a what's the term for it? It's like chemical waste. Like it's like they won't take it, and so I'm not comprehending what that is about. Again, it's the transportation piece. If you don't have seeds blowing around, you can get the cut material to a landfill or a location where you can just where it's high and dry and it just dries out, and it's not going to reinfest anywhere. With the seeds, you with the trucks, you can have the screens to contain the seeds, and then on site again you can cover with tarps to reduce seed spread if that's an issue, if it's been cut later in the season. But other than that, I don't know what the concern really is for moving Phragmites, to tell you the truth. So I guess it's just concern over spread, but again, that can certainly be dealt with if the material's moved responsibly.
And I'll recommend anyone who's transporting Phragmites to reach out to their local municipalities, and they can direct you to what the regulations are, and they are going to be different in different areas. I'll also recommend that you check out one of our past webinars by Gabrielle Van Bergen, and she has some protocols for transporting live biomass that I'm sure she'd be happy to share. So I have a question from Julia. Julia wants to know that when a local group in Ontario is requesting your help to come out and bring the truck store, how is that work getting paid for?
Yeah, the groups have to pay for that. So the groups have to fundraise or get apply for funding from whatever sources. I would love to be able to provide this service for free, but to be viable, I can't do that. I have a lot of expenses to cover. My goal is to try and get corporate sponsors to offset the true cost of doing this work, and so that I can pass that along to these other not-for-profits and these volunteer organizations. But basically, we have to recoup our expenses to remain viable. So yeah, so the groups do have to pay for the service.
And Julia also wants to know if you've ever tried a commercial composting system for the disposal of the biomass that you're cutting.
Yeah, so I haven't personally looked into that because like the groups I work with, like we work together, how to deal with the biomass disposal, and so far I haven't delved into the composting piece. I did have a conversation with Chris Cornfield yesterday, who's the manager of operations up in town of South Bruce, and he's looked into this, and as well. And with frag, you need a lot of organic material, I guess, to keep the temperatures high. So I guess there's options for dealing with frag, of course. With this large amount of biomass is coming, but really, my thing, like the piles shrink. Like they look huge when it's all wet, but they do shrink really quickly once they're drying out. And then once they're dry, they're not a problem. So it's just, if you can find space just to pile it, and eventually it's going to reduce substantially in volume. But yeah, you can, as mentioned, that firebox, that air burner, or composting or whatever, and mulching. There's some options.
Gwen has a question, but also wants you to know that this was a really great presentation, and we definitely agree on our end, Janice. Gwen would like to know, what water depth can the truck stores operate in? Because her concern is that Lake Huron is probably going to rise another 8 inches or even more with climate change. So how deep can these things go?
Oh, I guess I didn't mention, they're amphibious. You can go any water depth. Been across some pretty deep water channels. They float. So we can go from land way out to the deepest part of the water if we have to. The thing is the cutting depth, right? So our cutting heads can go down the water column, down deep into the water column over a meter to snip off the stalks. So that's a limiting factor right there. But we can go any water depth. That's not a problem. Where we do have to be careful is where the wave actions and where the guys are exposed to high onshore wind. If we're exposed, so if we can get on site and they can work back and behind that frag fringe, which is what they normally do. It's really site specific. But yeah, we don't have any water depth constraints for moving around.
Well, that's great news. Julia also has another question. She wanted to know, and maybe we can direct her to our website as well, but any research that has been done on the length that seed heads are viable?
Oh, so if they don't sprout in the spring, they're not going to sprout. Really, thank goodness that's the one good thing about Phragmites. It's not like cattail where the seeds are viable in the seed bank for over 100 years. So really short viability stretch there. And I don't know if any of you have tried to grow frag from seed, but it's not easy, actually. Where I see the most germination is where they're laying in really high nutrient sites, actually. But yeah, the germination period is very short. So if they don't sprout next spring, they're not going to sprout.
Good news.
Yes.
Leslie just has a comment. She says that they have Phragmites growing in 2 meters of water so it will grow in deeper than 1 meter, unfortunately. That's Leslie's
meter and a half, yeah. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
And then Jennifer would like to know, as a follow-up question, what are your frag removal rates if someone were to contact you for hire?
Yeah, so that's all really sites. As I said, if they think they need the trucksters, I go look at the site first, and because it all depends how many trucksters are needed, how many crew are needed, the collection barges, and all that other stuff, right? So it's really site specific.
And Janice's email is on the slide right now, so you're able to reach out to her with any other specific questions for your site, or if you're interested in working with Janice in the future. Any other questions, please type them in. We'll give another couple of minutes. But in the interim, Janice, I have a question for you. So you said that you have 100% mortality when you're cutting at or below 0.7 meters. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
So if you don't have water depth at that level and you're working with only a couple inches, is it effective to go out and continue to cut multiple times per year?
Yes, what I would recommend, and I didn't mention this with the spading, but if it's sandy or like a softer sediment where you can actually get a spade in, you're actually snip off that little stubble as well. So you're actually slicing the plant off down into the sediment and thereby depriving you even more oxygen. So if you can spade in the shallow water, all the better. But as I say, like the more you can cut as well in shallower water, the better as well. So if you're dealing with a small section and in your property, whatever, and you're able to go cut many times, I would certainly recommend that. Yeah.
Heather would like to know that we know now that the truckstores are amphibious, but are they able to get out through deep organic sediment to that water where they can float? Or do they have trouble moving through those mucky sediments?
So it's all about traction, right? So we have not had them in just pure organic. I mean, they've gone through organic muck and that, but not for large stretches. I honestly don't know. We haven't tried it out. And if we do, I'd like to do it in an area where we can at least pull them out if we have to. But I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure it's something I can ask the Truxor company over in Sweden, because they have a lot more experience using them over there in Europe as well. Or there may be, I know there's actually a rep in the States as well. So there may be folks that are using them that have had experience in organics. I have not.
Jennifer has another question. She wants to know, how many years repeated using the Truxor does it take until you can just do that maintenance manual removal?
For most of our sites, we've only had to take them in once. For a couple of sites, we had to go back in again, and it was significantly reduced, but we went back in again, and I was trying to figure out the why, and I don't know why the first cut didn't work, but on rare occasions we've had to go in twice and do that. But that would be the max. I don't believe we're going to have to go back to those sites again this year. So usually it's just once that we have to not use the truck source.
Great, and then we have a comment from Eric. Eric says the Marshmaster is more capable in the more extreme lakeshore environments. They cost about $150,000 each, and they work pretty well. So pricey, but apparently they work. And I think I just don't know the Marshmasters can cut underwater. That's all. No, I don't. I think you have to do manual cutting with the Marshmasters, if I understand that correctly. So I think we're going to cut off questions there. If anyone has any follow-up questions for Janice, please feel free to reach out. Her contact information is there. Janice, thank you so very much for taking the time to put that presentation together and share it with all of us today.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. If anyone tuned in late, it is going to be available on our YouTube channel, and you can have access through our webpage, and that's greatlakesphragmites.net. I want to quickly mention that we have our next webinar planned. That's going to be on Wednesday, February 19th at 10:30 Eastern. Sarah Marshall with Rare Charitable Research Reserve is going to talk to us about some of the experimental work they did using spading, herbicides, goat grazing, and infrared technology to control Phragmites. So we're very excited about that. You can register for that. That link isn't quite correct, so I apologize. It is just resources/webinar, not the -2. So you can go ahead and register on our webpage. And then I'd just like to acknowledge the U.S. Geological Survey and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative for providing the funding for the collaborative. As a reminder, the webinar recording will be posted on our webpage within the next couple of days. And if you have any additional follow-up questions or comments for us at the collaborative, please feel free to reach out. Our email is phragmites@glc.org. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and thanks so much, Janice. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.